Thank you and welcome to the show this morning. The topic this morning is the Methodist Church and historical black institutions of higher education. And of course, we have with us to talk about the Methodist Church and higher education, Dr. Cynthia CHopson. And Dr. CHopson will give us additional information in reference to her background, education, and some of your experiences, Dr. CHopson, that brought us together this morning. And what we'd like to do is to talk about over the first segment some of the things that you've been involved with and some of your publications, because we know that not only are you an administrator with the United Methodist Church, but you're also a great author. And so let's talk about you within that context, your experiences and your profile within that context.
Thank you, Dr. Haney, for having me here. I'm in my 6th year as Assistant General Secretary for the Black College Fund and Ethnic Concerns. I have one of the longest titles in the whole United Methodist Church, but I'm a journalism educator by training. Was Associate Professor of Journalism at the University of Memphis for 10.5 years before I came here to Nashville to work. Started out in radio 130 years ago and had to go to college because I had not gotten an undergraduate degree, and went to Clark when it was just Clark College, and now it's Clark Atlanta University, and got a bachelor's degree in mass communications and started working in media. Had a great time with that, and I really miss my students these days, but really enjoy the work that I'm doing here for the United Methodist Church. Got into writing books simply by accident. I grew up in Haywood County in Stanton, Tennessee. Haywood County is home to Tina Turner and Tony Delk and Alex Harvey of Delta Dawn fame, and was growing up there in the country. In the cotton field, the pea field, and so forth and so on.
Yes.
And so I guess it must have been about 1987 when the school in our community closed, and I called the editor of the local newspaper there in Brownsville and asked if it would be okay if I wrote some reflections about the school. Didn't really understand the history of the school, except it had been in my community all my life. And so she said, sure. And so I wrote that article and got such positive feedback from it. I talked to the editor again and said, well, how about if I just write some reflections from time to time about growing up in rural West Tennessee. And so she called my column that I wrote twice a month, Hobson's Haywood. And whenever I'd go places, people would tell me how much they enjoyed it or whatever, but I hadn't thought about doing anything with it. But my sister, well, there are 8 children in my family. I'm number 2 of 8, and my sister, child number 1, is a sociologist. And so she said, you really need to do something more with those. And I said, like what? And so she said, well, put them in a book or something. And so I didn't really give it much thought until I guess that was 2003. And I had by that time finished the PhD and had gotten a contract on my dissertation to write a book from that. But just couldn't get into it. I had had a fairly traumatic experience with my doctoral process, and so I just didn't want to be bothered with that piece of work. And so started working on this collection of columns and wrote a letter to the editor in Brownsville and said, would you give me permission to collect these columns and put them in a book? And they wrote me back and said, oh yeah, we would love for you to do that, and we'll buy the first 2 copies and we'll hook you up with a printer. So I really didn't have any excuse. And so my first book is called Wiggle Tales, and it's called Wiggle Tales because my first grade teacher, Mrs. Mamie Dale Reeves Bowles Dotson, taught first grade for 43 years and called the first graders Wiggle Tales. She said because they could hardly keep still. And so it's just a collection of those columns that I wrote for the newspaper. And after that, then the rest was easy. I did make my dissertation into a book, and it's called Times of Challenge and Controversy, It's a look at how the media did or did not cover voter registration in Haywood County in 1960 and 1961. And I kept thinking that something important had happened in 1960 and 61, but I couldn't put my finger on it. And I had a really hard time selling that idea to my dissertation committee. And one of my colleagues from Cameroon, of all places, said, well, have you looked at the New York Times about what happened in Haywood County? And I thought, why would I look at the New York Times? And he said, well, they covered a lot of what went on. And I was amazed. I looked, and there were all kinds of stories about what had happened in Haywood and Fayette County with the tent city and how
poor folks and
got evicted
boycotting
from,
and
how they were evicted from their homes during
in your hometown.
Absolutely,
too, that's right.
during the winter of 1960 and 61. And so once
let's have this first commercial break.
Oh, okay.
And of course, we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. Yeah.